The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. This is our monthly episode 4, where we get to ask our speaker all the questions that we've gotten from our episodes for the month so far. And by the way, thanks for all your questions and feedback. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. As I've thought about the episodes that we've had with Dr. Abrams this month, I've just been so incredibly grateful because I think navigating the world of formula is difficult and has become more difficult over the last few years. And Steve, thanks so much for coming back to answer some questions.
Always glad to be on your show.
Before we start, do you have any disclosures?
None.
Let's dive right in. There are more reports in the news recently about the presence of cereulide in formulas. Can you help me understand both what the importance of cereulide in formula is and what the controversy is about U.S. regulation versus European regulation of formula safety?
Like all recalls, the investigation is ongoing. This issue was largely one that occurred with formulas that were sold in Europe. And that's because some of the long-chain fatty acids that were used in the production of the formula were made from a different source than we usually use in the United States and had a bacterial toxin in them that could cause an upset stomach and some significant illness. So even though there were not very many infants, if any, involved in Europe, the presence and the measurable presence of this toxin led to a very large recall in Europe. Initially, we thought there were going to be no formulas involved with this in the United States, but it turns out that these different products are sourced from a lot of different places around the world, and a very small amount of formula sold in the United States was at risk and was recalled. The important thing is that the FDA monitors all global recalls of formula to make sure that there isn't anything that might involve the U.S. formula or a formula that would be legally sold in the United States, which is why it's also so important to be really paying attention to using formulas that are registered in the United States. Nonetheless, this was an example of the fact that a lot of vigilance and FDA oversight is needed. But I think for the most part, this particular recall is of limited concern within the United States.
So if I understand what you're saying, the FDA monitors what's happening abroad as well with the formulas that are imported. Are there major differences between the two, at least between the European regulatory agencies and the FDA in terms of safety?
There really aren't. People think that they are. They are different organizations. They do have slightly different ways in which they evaluate how formulas get put on the market, and there are some differences in the testing required to get formulas on the market. But in terms of safety, in terms of recalls and things like that, the processes are pretty similar and, again, involve oversight agencies and appropriate recalls.
Well, and the great thing about that is that the stakes are high. Infant health is important. Next question. Why do formula makers remove lactose from formulas that are designed for babies with sensitive digestion? Isn't lactose in breast milk?
Lactose is the primary carbohydrate in breast milk, and it is removed from as many as half or so of all U.S. formulas, or at least reduced, not necessarily completely removed. And this has largely been a puzzlement to many of us in the field because this lactose deficiency or inadequate ability to tolerate lactose is extraordinarily rare in infants in the United States. It's not like in older children or adults. And because it is a natural product, we have concerns about taking away the natural carbohydrate. It's done because there's some perception, sometimes among families, that the babies will tolerate the formula, have less spitting or upset stomach. But there's absolutely no evidence to support that. Now, recently, there's been several studies that have suggested that the ability to tolerate glucose or levels of serum glucose in the blood may be higher in babies when the lactose is removed and replaced with glucose polymers. This is an ongoing area of investigation. We don't have any clinical outcomes that are very clearly well defined with that, but nonetheless, we would encourage families not to perceive low lactose formulas as being necessarily better or use that for babies who have trouble tolerating formulas, even if they have great names to the formula for them.
Even if they have persuasive names.
Persuasive names would be a good,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And just to go back to something we talked about a couple of years ago, when lactose is replaced, frequently it's with corn syrup solids. And as you pointed out a couple of years ago, that's not the same thing as high fructose corn syrup.
It is not, but nonetheless, it does have the potential for spiking blood glucose levels a little bit higher in some infants. Again, whether or not that's a genuine clinical concern remains needing more investigation and more research, but there was a recent study that's taken a look at some of this and does raise some concerns about that. And because there's no reason, no benefit to low lactose formula in virtually any baby, the idea that the lactose reduced formulas are half or more of the US marketplace is really a puzzlement.
Next question. Is there a way to navigate the difference between fussiness related to feeds and the regular fussiness that we see increasing in infants over the first several weeks of life, the developmental fussiness? Breastfed babies get fussier as well. And I don't see as much counsel to women to make strict modifications in their diet, yet we often see formulas blamed for gassiness and fussiness. Thoughts?
They got that absolutely correct on every on every ground. The reality is rarely can we attribute one particular formula that's just generalized fussiness. Specific signs of cow milk protein allergy or intolerance, bloody stools, abdominal distension, or symptoms such as severe, frequent, high volumes of spitting and throwing up all the time. Those are medically concernable, and the pediatrician needs to evaluate them. But generally, mild fussiness, what we might call mild colic, which every baby has, small amounts of spitting, which occur in almost every baby, rarely respond to formula changes. Some babies do have one formula that they like a little bit more than the other, and certainly making perhaps one formula switch to see if a baby tolerates another one better is worth it. But continuously cycling different formulas till you find that magic one, what really happens by the time you found that magic formula, the baby's simply outgrowing those symptoms.
I often tell people that if you make a formula change once a week, whichever one you land on at about 6 or 7 weeks is going to be the one they like.
That's right. So best thing to do, again, I'm not going to say never change a formula for those type of symptoms, but be aware that most of those changes don't make much difference, and don't keep cycling through different formulas because that's not the solution.
And one thing that's even more frustrating for parents these days is a formula change is not a trivial undertaking. As we were talking about before, formula is very expensive these days. And so it's daunting to say, and now I should buy this other formula and this more expensive formula.
Absolutely. And we still have this perception, sometimes supported directly or indirectly by the companies, that the more expensive a formula, the better it must be.
Yeah.
Which is, that may be true for your car, it might be true for your expensive boat, but it's not true for your infant formula. There's
Yeah.
no evidence that buying the most expensive formula makes it a better formula.
As an aside, before we get to our last question, I was talking to a patient a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about our conversation, and they said, "Are you telling me that I could have saved that much money not buying the most expensive formula on the market?"
And the answer is, yep, I sure am.
I sure am. There goes the college fund. All right, last question from our friend Miguel Knokel. Do you have a favorite all-inclusive place for formula fortification recipes for when I need to fortify the formula? Background. Oh, he says I don't have to read this part out loud, but I'm going to read this part out loud. Should be simple, but there are many variations, like adding a teaspoon or a half teaspoon to 3 ounces of breast milk or already prepared formula. Recipes that only give you big amounts, like 5 ounces, amounts of water versus final volume, different recipe if it's preterm formula, etc. I want something that's easy for me and for the parents to understand. I don't always have a dietitian around when I need to discharge an infant from the hospital. As inpatients, we rarely use powder. They get ready to feed liquid formula, or the formula lab mixes it using a concentrate and gives it to the nurse, which means the parents and nurse are not getting practice mixing with powder. And the first time they'll use powder is at home. Thoughts?
All those are legitimate concerns and kind of beat at the concerns of how best do we prepare formula, boiling water, when do you need to boil, all those kind of practical questions that families have often are hard to get good answers to. I can tell you from a practical sense, there's really two good resources. One is that each of the two companies that make the homegoing transitional formulas and preterm formulas do maintain websites as well as staff that are available with fairly little effort to answer specific questions. It's not hard to write to them or email them. Some of them may even have or do have online resources that have that material, but sometimes you have to sign on. There's also some groups that have put out those type of information that he's looking for. There's one that I've sent you a link, I know, up on the website from the University of Minnesota that has a lot of those calculations on there for the baby. And then the last resource I would tell people is almost wherever you are, there's going to be a NICU or a NICU dietitian somewhere that will be glad to take a phone call and help you with that. And even if it's a baby that's going home, let's say at a couple weeks of age from, let's say, some other illness that they're in the hospital for, but maybe isn't growing ideally and you feel like you need to be fortified, those NICU dietitians will love to give you a hand because they have pages of those calculations out there.
The one thing adding a degree of difficulty to all this, as I was doing a little background reading, is that some of the imported formulas use different ratios and different base measurements. And so don't lose their mixing cup, and be aware that it's not going to necessarily be the same way you've been mixing things up.
That's right. And that's why even when using online resources like the one from the University of Minnesota, it's always good to be careful about what you're doing. And I think that the best thing is to try to find a dietitian, whether or not it's from the company directly or your favorite NICU dietitian, because they'll be glad to help you because they deal with this as the babies go home from the NICU every day, and they've got all those calculations out there for you.
And they're very helpful for people who have spent years getting the expertise to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, anything else you want to share?
No, I think that really pretty well covers it. And I look forward to either via you or else we're getting any feedback people have for other topics people want to chat about.
It's been a delight talking. I almost look forward to more formula changes so we can find another excuse to talk.
Take care.
All right. All the best to you. Thanks for listening. Tell your friends, like and subscribe, and do all those things that help people find us. We'll talk to you again next week. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The virtual curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Thanks to Paul Wirkus, who composed the theme music. See you next time.